first will kick off with a quick introduction into what we see as outcome-based portfolio management. So quickly describing how does portfolio management currently work, what are potential problems, what problems have we seen and discovered with our customers and partners, why do we see a change, and how this is going to look like. Then going a little bit more into detail into the benefits of outcome-based portfolio management, what are different stakeholders, and what are their needs and benefits with regard to this topic. And then I hand over to Joël, and Joël is then getting even more concrete into how to get started. So what levels to look at and how technology can help and what our current assumptions and hypotheses are, how this can be scaled throughout the organization. So yeah, let's start off. So where do we jump off? Basically, right now, what we've seen and what you are also experience is that the strategic priorities, budget, resource allocation in organizations are rather handled in a very top-down fashion. So basically start off with defining overarching strategic goals, then define the broader resource allocation, and then break that down into very detailed programs and projects. And what we see here as a potential problem and why we see a change happening in the last years is that the bottom-up feedback loop is missing. And this bottom-up feedback loop basically for us is a missing piece of information for an even better goal definition and a resource allocation. What do we mean by that? That can be two different things. So either we inform decisions around what should be our strategic goals, what is actually our capacity in the planning phase. So when we define the higher level priorities based on, for example, what have we achieved in the past with this with these kind of resources. So what can we assume for the future? Or not only in the planning phase, but also in the continuous execution phase, because normally we talk a lot about very long cycles here. So informing decision and initiating course corrects in between during the execution phase. That's also something where we see a bottom-up motion missing, and where a more outcome-oriented way could help. If we look a little bit from a different perspective, so far what we've seen, or what also many of our customers tell us as a problem, is that the portfolio management is very much output focused compared to the aspired outcome way of working. Quick detour, because I'm not sure how familiar you are with these different kind of terms. So by output, I usually like to refer to any kind of artifact which comes out of a project, like a specific feature, for example, of a digital product or so. And with the outcome, we always like to refer to what is the actual result or the customer value this specific feature, for example, is driving. And what we've seen as a problem is that if we remember the last slide, is if we have this top-down cascading of project or like higher level programs and then into single projects, the focus also remains very much on the output logic, and that the actual customer value, what actually you want to drive, is kind of missing. And in the end, also, in order for you to be able to control and to evaluate whether what you've planned was successful and what you learn out of it, that remains basically on what kind of things you produced, but not actually what kind of customer value you drove with your programs there. And then a last angle we see is a more process-oriented perspective. So if we talk about the large organizations, and we usually work with large enterprises, this is a very decentralized process where lots of projects and potential initiatives are handed in, and then a central unit team makes the decision based on normally the 3 criteria: strategic fit, profitability, and feasibility. And in the end, where you want to end up, where you want to end up with is basically a prioritized list of different projects. And what we see here as a potential problem is that there's so much central decision making concentrated in a small team that there's a very high likelihood of different information missing for a good and sound decision. So we see a trend here that a more decentralized and autonomous way of decision making might be needed in order to make that more successful. Right. And then trying to summarize what we see is basically that business agility in the end calls also for different ways of allocating resources. What do we mean by that? So we work a lot with our customers on how to make their goal setting, their OKR process more agile. But in the end, if you only look at your goals and how define and execute on goals in a more agile manner, but your resources you allocate remain in a rather waterfall methodology of allocating, then it's going to be kind of difficult also for the different teams and leaders in your organization to have like this detached notion of different strategic processes. So what we see is when we also talk about business agility is that we see a shift from an efficiency and control paradigm to a stronger agility and resource allocation. The bottom-up notion to engage also the employees and increase their autonomy, their engagement into these decisions. And also the need from the markets and the customer needs, because they are changing on a faster scale. Okay, that seems to be. Joel, can you quickly confirm whether you can hear me, because there was a question?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Right, then yeah, maybe also looking at the last point. So fast changing market environment might also make it necessary to change your resource allocation on a more frequent way than on an annual budget cycle or a longer term horizon, because of the learnings you make. All right, then let's turn a little bit more into what we see as outcome-based portfolio management. So let's ignore the left side for now, because we talked about the problems a bit, and let's talk more about the solution. So what are the themes we see when we talk about outcome-based portfolio management? And if you go through them, they're quite similar to, like, also when you have experience with working with OKRs, to the principles which are also behind, which we see behind OKRs. So it's a clear focus on outcome over outbound. So a clear focus on customer value, shorter cycles, so faster feedback loops. Do we move into the right direction? And more predictability and a more forecasting way of doing things, and that this continuous reporting and these shorter cycles, they allow also an earlier detection of potential risk or developments into the wrong direction, so you can also course correct faster. And how I also like to summarize this outcome-based portfolio management approach is basically that you turn your strategic steering processes from the inside to the outside. So you focus on your customers and your markets and adapt your organization and your processes towards that. And we also see that same notion happening to the resource allocation or portfolio management part. Here, I only want to focus on the right side. So what we see is that although we are a software company, it's not only about software, and we acknowledge that. So to really make this work, we see three main levers how to make a transition or a first step here successful. So since we talk about a major change in how your organization works, the people side is definitely important. The system side is important to make it scalable at some point, because you need to have different sets of data integrated and harmonized with each other to make these decisions. And you also should look at what are the different strategic steering processes. We put OKR here as a representative, but actually you should really look at, okay, how do we define goals and prioritize in our organization? What are the different processes running? And how can we harmonize that not only on a system, but also on a process perspective, because you also don't want to end up in like redundant or doubled work. And then if that happens, we see lots of different benefits happening. And this is going to be the second part. But maybe we quickly pause in case you have any questions. Feel free to put them into the Q&A section. We'll pause for a minute if something pops up, and if not, we'll continue. And no worries, we also have a later Q&A section at the end, so enough time to go through all your questions. Right, so slowly moving forward, getting a bit more concrete. We know it's a bit theoretical and conceptual at that level, but I promise the longer we go, the more concrete it will become. So here in this part, so we touched upon the change and why it should change the portfolio management process in general. Let's look at different stakeholders right now and what we've learned, how they look at the portfolio management and the potential transformation of it. So the main stakeholders we identified was the top level management in a very general sense, including the CFO perspective, the CIO as the main owner of the contribution of the IT and product portfolio, and then the portfolio management office as like the process owners, and then the business unit leads, who are basically the recipients in some sense of what comes out of the portfolio management process. And of course, there are also, this is not a clear-cut differentiation between the different stakeholders there, but we'll also see that in a bit in the concrete needs and benefits.
Sorry, Michael, before you get into the benefits of each of them, we have a question from Maria Pan, who says, can you give an example of an outcome defined at portfolio level? Which I think is an important question to answer before moving forward.
Yeah, sorry, can you quickly repeat it? I didn't get the second part.
Yes. Can you give an example of an outcome defined at portfolio level?
Yeah. Let me quickly think about it.
But I can jump in if you want. So you're really thinking less about big programs of work that you need to deliver, which is what outputs are, and you're thinking more about probably a strategic objective around moving some of your underlying key business indicators in one way or another. So it could be increase in revenue, gain in market share in a specific area. These kind of metrics that are really what the organization is trying to achieve as an outcome. And when you talk about outcome, you're not specifying necessarily how you're going to get there. You want to set the direction and get the team to figure out what is the best way to get there. So you're moving from defining initiatives that have outcomes to defining outcomes, and then working around that to start planning your portfolio.
Yeah, I also like to refer always to a metric driver tree in your organization, like based on the high level metrics, Joel, you were just referring to, and then basically based on the horizon, you also want to look at your portfolio level. Look at also what is the metric you can or the outcome you can really change during that horizon, depending on the exact metric to look at. Right. Then looking at the top level management. So what we see here as a main benefit is that we can even increase the efficient use of resources and increase the transparency on the delivered promises with outcome-based portfolio management. How do we do so? So in the end, the primary need for top-level management is to maximize goal achievement within specific financial targets, constraints from the organization, and executing on the long-term strategy. And we already touched upon it, like if we identify risks earlier in terms of goal achievement, we can basically reduce our outcome waste, or the waste of resources on outcomes which were based on wrong hypotheses, but we can shift these resources more frequently and even earlier, instead of like after 1 or 2 years during the next revision cycle, for example. So it's a very powerful tool to increase efficiency, but not only on a minimum paradigm. So basically cutting costs at all levels, but basically making sure that the resources we have in place, that they can really focus on maximizing customer value, and by that also maximizing efficiency. And it's also it's basically something we've heard a lot is also that once the specific allocation of resources in the portfolio management has been done, there was not much transparency on how do these investments go? Yeah, how do we do? Is the promised impact delivered? I think this more continuous way of reporting is something which can also help opening up that black box of where did our money actually go to, not in terms of org structure, but really in terms of outcome driving activities. If we look at the CIO, it's very similar to the top level management, but it's basically focused on like, okay, how can I, with the contribution of the IT and product portfolio, how can I contribute the most and impact the most, or have the most impact on the top level goals? And one key theme we observed is that there's this need to create a shared language between the business and the IT departments to basically break up the silos which have been there. And the outcome-oriented way is a way of doing that, because we go away from talking about technical specifics or technical characteristics of a specific output or feature, but we really have a shared language of what is the business outcome we want to drive with what we are doing here. And that can create a shared language between different silos, between business and IT in that sense. Besides that, also the CIO is very much focused on the efficiency aspect. How can we maximize revenue with a certain set of resources? How can we reduce costs or reduce outcome waste when we have a certain set of goals we want to achieve? So these are also things similar to the top level management, which we see possible with outcome-based portfolio management. The portfolio management office, as the process owners for us, we see a lot of interest in like, okay, how can we run a very efficient and compliant process? And I think that's not like super straightforward or super easy, but we see the potential to actually decrease management overhead. How do we see that? We quickly talked about how do you integrate different levels in terms of outcome-based portfolio management. So we talked about the people perspective, the system perspective, and your other strategic steering processes perspective. And that's of course a requirement to decrease management overhead in the end. Because if you have parallel process in running in the end, that's of course a rather increase. But if your strategic goal setting process is integrated with portfolio management, so for example, if you already do OKRs in some way, and this is integrated also how you allocate resources or do your portfolio management, then that's actually a benefit also for the portfolio management office. And if they spend less time on conducting and administrating the process, they can also have more capacity and capabilities on consulting and making the strategic decisions about the resource allocation part. And then as a last stakeholder, the business unit leads. As the recipients of the resource allocated in the portfolio management office, they are of course interested in maximizing the resources they get out of this process in order to then maximize the output or outcome of their part of the organization. And for them, it's very similar. If the less time you spend in strategic steering processes and management processes, the more you can focus, and you can focus your organization or your part of the organization on actually executing on these priorities. And there's also what we also see is that if you have these parallel processes running who are not integrated with each other, so for example your OKR process or your portfolio management process, it's very difficult to basically, okay, what is actually the set of criteria I optimize or prioritize against my part of the organization. And there will always be a tendency towards portfolio management because there the budget is basically assigned. So we see basically also a faster and easier way of executing through less confusion what is actually the priority from an organization perspective. Right. With that, if there are no further questions, Joel, I would hand over to you. And yeah, you let me know when I should move on.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. So we're gonna move on to the place to get started with outcome-based portfolio management. Keeping in mind that, as I've said before, it's a very developing topic. We have our views and we've started working with some of our customers on this topic, but I would not say there is a world expert or a place today where you would say that's perfectly implemented. And so this is sort of work in progress thoughts and the first step that we've taken. Can you go to the next slide? So the first thing to get started, if you think about what it means to move toward outcome-based portfolio management, you are essentially trying to plug the process of portfolio management onto your slightly more agile, OKR-driven kind of way of running your of getting to outcomes in your organization. And so it's not something that comes easily, and not surprisingly, we're talking about people and processes. There's a lot of transformation that you need to go through. It's a bit difficult to give a specific recipe on how to do it, because every organization operates differently. But we have identified some pointers of some areas that are going to be critical to think through, to figure out how you're going to get these two parts, these two processes to work together. You don't expect an immediate transformation. I worked in the past with, for example, BHP, so second biggest mining company. Their portfolio management process starts 6 months before the following financial year, runs 3 months in the first financial year, and allocates tens of billions of dollars in funding. It's clearly not something that changes with a click of a finger, right? But here's what we think is important to get started and to assess. The first thing is like really the purpose, and you're moving your portfolio management process from negotiating a budget towards steering toward the ambition. And so it's not business unit trying to come and say, I want to fund X and Y because I think that's what's the most important. It's very much the organization saying, here's what's more important. Now, tell us where, how you can contribute, and the allocation is going to be based on the value of the contribution that you can do to the strategic objectives. And so to do that, you need to have a very clear ambition in financial and strategic outcomes. Something that companies tend to do reasonably well at a management level, but not necessarily communicate very well down the organization. And that becomes a center part of what you need to do if you want to move toward outcome-based portfolio management. And so your strategic vision needs to be ready to provide top-down guidance, much more than traditionally. In terms of content, you're moving from high level of details as an input to your portfolio management to business drivers and business-related actions, probably lower level of detail to some extent upfront in the specification, but much more adjustments down the road, right? And so you need to manage the fact that you have a bit less certainty upfront and a bit more ability to monitor and correct. And when I say manage the fact, it's a change in mentality of how you're going to be looking at the initiatives and how much detail you need to ask for and how much control you think that you have from the beginning. I mean, in reality, there's an illusion of certainty that you have when you do a large program of work planning, because anyway things can change. OKR is typically pretty good at dealing with that, but you need to, and that's why it's so popular, but you need to break that certainty of, I believe I have the truth in the beginning and everything's going to go according to plan, and moving toward, I believe I had a fairly good idea and I trust the process to correct down the road to get to the right outcome. And so you're also going to be moving from measuring progress to measuring business impact, which requires a little bit of change at a senior level and a lot of change in the organization as well. The third point that you're going to need to think about changing is the processes. So it's moving very much from a bottom-up planning and iterations, top-down adjustment yearly, to a process which is more driven by the OKR, where you have your top-down target setting, and then bottom-up operational planning and execution on a quarterly basis, with much more touch points to revisit, adjust, change the course, and decide what is the right thing to do to get to the outcomes that you want to achieve. So it requires a change of mindset, especially in middle management. It requires you to transform toward a more agile organization. And when I talk about mindset in middle management, it's not only the way of working, but like your compensation system, for example, might be very well linked to, are you hitting your target in terms of delivering on a project? And you need to shift that in terms of outcome potentially, or choose to separate them to a large extent. The fourth point that you need to think about in terms of transformation is IT and tech and all the supporting systems to be able to drive your outcome-based portfolio management. You're going to need to move in a world where the flow of information are going to be much more consistent across the whole organization, because you need the information to be available often on a quarterly basis or even often correct. And so you cannot afford to have systems where people spend a lot of time in spreadsheets once a year to figure out how you went about delivering your portfolio of work. And you need something more harmonized. And that could be either having integrated system that gets released everywhere, or much more data integration and having a very capable data team who's able to make the information, the important information flow across your organization. And the fifth one is changing in behavior, incentivize on reaching individual targets toward collaboration. OKR is by its nature, and if it's well done, a much more collaborative process, because it tends to pull the teams from across the organization collaborating on the same outcome together. But not every organization is ready for that. Typically, organization collaborate and align very well top-down along the organization structure, and not so well cross-team in collaborating between departments to reach the same outcomes. And so there's some thinking to do in that space to really get to a place where that can work. And so that could be partly decoupling the incentive from individual outputs, because you want collaboration as a way of getting to the outputs, and then encouraging collaboration and cross-team alignments. And it can be done through tools. There's a bunch of ways of doing that, but you're going to need to find a way of making it work for you. So fully acknowledging this is high level, but there are really good pointers that you need to think about when you want to go down that road. Next step. Yep. And so Workpath being Workpath, we have a history of being a product organization. And so we've been also thinking about how can you support such a process with the tools that we have. We have a fairly complete suite in the to manage your OKR process, and to some extent as a VP product, the question is how do you extend that into supporting the portfolio management, and how do you build on what you have to make sure that you have all the right additional capabilities beyond OKRs to support portfolio management. If you go to the next slide, not that one, thank you. And so outcome portfolio management, before I jump into the tool, inherently is going to change a little bit the way the portfolio management process is run, in the sense that you're moving from typically a very long gathering of information upfront to provide all the information to the portfolio management board to make big decisions that then gets cascaded top down. And it's almost like a all or nothing. And typically you've either got your budget or not got your budget, and then it's set for the year, right? And you're moving to a process which is a bit more iterative, especially in the planning phase, where you have some top down early, which are around the objectives that you're trying to achieve. Then the different business units or areas can figure out how to best go to achieve these objectives. And so it's then that can go back bottom up to the portfolio board, who do the allocation and the assessment. And then that gets cascading back from the portfolio management office to the organization. But contrary to portfolio management, it doesn't really stop there, and it keeps happening much more continuously through the year there, because you have ongoing evaluation, assessment of the outcome, and adjustments to get to the outcomes. If you go to the next slide, Michael, and that's a little bit what we've been thinking when we're thinking about the tools and how to support the portfolio management. So you start with a set of strategic drivers, and you need a way of communicating that to your organization, which is, here are the outcomes that are really important for the organization that we want to achieve. your teams then start to figure out how to achieve that, and you then get in a second step where you have a view, at least a first high-level view of what are the different contributions to the outcomes, and you can have discussions about which of these outcomes are the most important, likely to succeed, where do we have risk, how much resources would that take. You iterate that a couple of times, and then you get to your final compilation of the portfolio, which is the third step, where essentially you say, as of today, here's the best view of where we want to go for the next probably year. Let's put that in a portfolio that then becomes dynamic and can be revisited in step 4, which is the ongoing execution all along the year. If you go to the next slide, Michael. And so what does that mean a little bit in practice, because it's still a little bit abstract. The first part, which is the strategic drivers, is probably gonna translate in major organizational objectives for your company, who are going to be over a long period of time, like 1 or 2 years at the very least. They could be more than that, and they're typically going to be coming either from the strategic initiative that you have defined as the way for the company to succeed, or the operational and financial metrics that you want to influence, because they're sort of your day-to-day, and you need to keep delivering on them and improving on them. And so you end up with a set of organizational objectives, long running, that you're going to communicate to your teams and say, well, here's where you really need to spend your efforts, and here's where you need to think about support. This is what you need to support, and where you need to be thinking about how do I achieve these objectives. And so in our world, that probably translates in organizational goals for at least a year. You then communicate that to your organization, and they come back with what is typical from any portfolio planning, which is a set of initiatives or ways of achieving the outcomes. You use the power of OKRs to make sure that they are defined first by the objectives that you're trying to achieve, the key results, and how you would reach them, and then you have typically your initiatives and your portfolio. But they're very much articulated in what's the outcome I want to hit, right? And that's what you're going to be assessing on, because once you have that information, you can figure out how much capital will it take, what's the level of risk, how impactful are they going to be to the organization, how well do they adjust to the organization goals that we have set in the first step. And so you can have a very data-driven review on a set basis of every single outcomes proposed by the different teams, and do your prioritization based on that. If you go then to the next level, which is essentially the outcome of the prioritization, you end up with a portfolio which is very much what are the goals for the organization, and probably now on a quarterly basis, because that's what your teams have communicated to you, and how do they all align to the organization goal that are long running. And so that is sort of akin, or that would be akin to the first steps of your traditional OKR planning in the first cycle of your annual portfolio management cycle. The interesting part here, and I think every organization deals about it differently, is your allocation of resources is typically going to be of two types. It's either going to be money, which is a bit more fungible and can move around and reasonably easy to allocate, or it's going to be people, and you there have a much more limited capacity, or at least constrained capacity, that you cannot expand very quickly. And so one of the aspects that we look at a lot in the portfolio management is how can you identify the contribution of the teams and the available people capacity for the different opportunities, and that's where a lot of the trade-offs need to happen. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about that specific aspect of portfolio management. Where are you constrained in terms of people? And what that results in means you're going to have a view of how are your teams contributing to the different organizational goals, and you can start looking at misalignments and resource allocation, and what are the teams that are scarce and what are the teams that should be working with other teams. That's a natural output of your portfolio management planning here. And it's something that's very, very useful to discuss within, like to cascade in the organization and try to resolve and allocate resources there. And then if you go to the next step, Michael, that's very much the part that exists way less in, in traditional portfolio management, which is enabled by the OKRs to a large extent, which is this continuous process of constant monitoring, reassessments, and empowerment of the teams to make decisions and to adjust and find the best way to get to the outcomes that you have set on an organization level. You have moved from a world where you are delivering project X in the next 12 months to an outcome where you start by working on project X and you have a good chance that it's your best case to deliver the outcome in the next 12 months, but you're going to know more after 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, and you're going to have a continuous reassessment every quarter on, is it still the best thing to work on? And that's going to be informed by your likelihood of hitting the outcomes. So this becomes much more if you're familiar with OKR, the realm of OKRs, then you can see how that's plugged to the portfolio management, because all this information gets now reaggregated and communicated in a portfolio view to the management or the organization, and they have this continuous view and capability of adjustment. So that's very much the top view from the leadership and the portfolio management. If you go to the next step, Michael, we have also been working on sort of one of the underlying capability that's really critical for that, which is team resources and team allocations, and where you have constraints and bottleneck in the capacity of your team, because you have some talents which are very scarce or at the crossroad of a lot of different initiatives and very much on demand. And we think about that in 2 ways, or in 2 steps. The first one is just getting a better view of what is the capacity available across all the different teams, and having realistic view of how much work they can spend on your strategic initiatives, because teams tend to be very busy with the day-to-day operational work, and so you want to have very early a view of where you're going to have constraints and how much capacity is free to allocate in your portfolio, and so that's typically done very early on by the team leads to figure out how much time can my team spend on the portfolio. And then the second stage in the next slide is much more when you have started doing your allocation of resources, getting the team to specifically explain how much of their time is contributing to which of the organizational goals. And it becomes useful then more as a tool to measure whether, as an organization, you are really spending the scarce resources on the most important goals, right? One of the challenges when you go with, when you don't have that view is, you know that your teams are busy and you don't really know whether they're busy on the right thing. And that's exactly what we're trying to solve here. And the OKR process actually helps very well in supporting that. And the third, the last point is that on the next slide, that gives you a view for the portfolio management of where are your teams busy, what are they working on at any point in time, and is it the right thing? And so when you get in these course correction cycles, you can have a discussion about, but hang on, we're spending 50% of our resources on the second from the bottom priority, and is it really the right way of allocating our portfolio? So it allows for more meaningful conversations there. That's it for me. Happy to take questions, and I think they could be related to these topics or also to portfolio management in general. No questions at the moment. To who is this part of the tool? So we have a question, which is, to who is this part of the tool available? So the aspect of specifically the capacity management and getting visibility on your team is available to all of our customers today. The aspect of portfolio management, which is more the first part I was explaining, is still getting worked on. But we're very interested if you have ideas, or if you're interested to, you can get in touch with us and we can figure out how to work with you on a beta and get it available for you as early as possible. Okay, we have some question in the chat. How is capacity defined? Only FTEs? Any guidance from the top on work in progress limits? If not, why not? So, Maria-Pan, let me try to answer that as much as I can based on what I understand of the question. So, how is capacity defined? Well, typically you have, as I was saying, you have two constraints in terms of your allocation of resources, and they're going to be money, which is defined in a very, very simple way when you have funding for projects, but not organizational part that way. And the other one tends to be people. And so, yes, FTEs is a very good way of defining capacity, because that gives you a view of how much work can you do in each of the different parts of the organization, which is in the end what you're going to need to allocate, right? Decide what project X and Y or initiative X and Y are contributing to that outcome, and here's how much time they're going to take from the team, and that's what you allocate. A guidance from the top on work in progress limits. If not, why not? Yes. So if I understand well, when you talk about work in progress limits, that means the amount of work where the team is working without having demonstrated a meaningful contribution to the outcomes, which I think if you think about the world of projects and program, was very much one of the flaws of the traditional waterfall program management methodologies, where your whole team was working for 9 months before you had any view on whether you were getting to an outcome or an output, even an outcome. I think inherently OKRs help with that, especially if you set your cycles on a short period of time. And so we recommend typically 3 to 4 months maximum for an OKR cycle, which means you have to demonstrate the progress toward the outcomes within that period. And you're having even shorter reviews within that cycle. We recommend every 2 weeks, where if you're not to the outcome yet, at the very least, you communicate on your confidence of hitting the outcomes. And so you can get a sense, even if you have a lot of work in progress, whether the team believes that they're on the right track to hit the outcome or not. So that's the way that OKRs typically help with the work in progress problem. So it's OKRs and also agile methodologies if you're very much in the tech space. That's another way of limiting the work in progress.